Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hope you're doing well. We are continuing our reading of Suetonius' Lives of the Caesars. We're in the section now of Caligula, Gaius Caligula, and it is intense. We read Tiberius, Augustus, Gaius Julius Caesar, and now we're in Caligula's section. Let's begin. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. He held 4 consulships, one from the calends of July for 2 months, a second from the calends of January for 30 days, a third up to the Ides of January, and the 4th until the 7th day, before the Ides of the same month. Of all these, only the last 2 were continuous. The third he assumed lugdunum without a colleague, not at some think through arrogance or disregard of precedent, but because at that distance from Rome he had been unable to get news of the death of the other consul just before the day of the calends. He twice gave the people a largesse of 300 sesterces each, and twice a lavish banquet to the Senate and the equestrian order. We hear about the equestrian order a lot, together with their wives and children. At the former of these he also distributed togas to the men, and to the women and children scarves of red and scarlet. So scarves, women partially covering their hair. Oh, don't tell the MAGA people they want to ban the hijab. Oh, scums. Furthermore, to make a permanent addition to the public gaiety, he added a day to the Saturnalia and called it Juvenalis. So, to make things kind of party-like, kind of frolicky, joyous, celebratory, he added another day to Saturnalia. He gave several gladiatorial shows, some in the amphitheater of Taurus, and some in the Septa, in which he introduced pairs of African and Campanian boxers. Wow, boxing, look at that. The pick of both regions, he did not always preside at the games in person, but sometimes assigned the honor to the magistrates or to friends. He exhibited stage plays, so we have stage plays here, continually of various kinds and in many different places, sometimes even by night, lighting up the whole city. He also threw about gift tokens of various kinds, and gave each man a basket of victuals. During the feasting, he sent his share to a Roman knight opposite him, who was eating with evident relish and appetite, while to a senator, for the same reason, he gave a commission naming him praetor. Out of the regular order, he also gave many games in the circus. So many games in the circus. Lots of games. The gladiatorial games, those contests. I mean, if I lived back then, I think I too would want to see that. Football is, as in the NFL, American football, is pretty boring. You get a good MMA match, but I think that I would have some intense curiosity to see actual contests where there's going to be some risk involved. Lasting from early morning until evening, introducing between the races now a baiting of panthers. So a baiting of panthers, the black panthers. So this is where we see the large felines coming into play. And now the maneuvers of the game called Troy, some too of special splendor, in which the circus was strewn with red and green, while the charioteers were all men of senatorial rank. Look at that. Charioteers of senatorial rank. Chariots, we'll write over here in the margins. So, imagine Chuck Schumer. That's a palota. Even Bernie Sanders. You know, I like Bernie, but it would be funny to see him like behind a chair. He also started some games offhand, when a few people called for them from the neighboring balconies, as he was inspecting the outfit of the circus from the Gallotian house. So Gallotian house. That sounds like a box where they sit in positions, kind of like how in an opera house there's certain boxes that are very expensive. At least traditionally. I haven't been to an opera since I was a teen. Or tween rather. My dad took me to actually Broadway. I don't think you can count that as an opera. So at least if you think of what you've seen in movies, that box, the old vintage ones. I don't know if opera houses look like that anymore. Maybe they still do in Italy, but I don't know if they do in America. Besides this, he devised a novel and unheard of kind of pageant, for he bridged the gap between Baiae and the mole at Puteoli, a distance of about 3,600 paces, by bringing together merchant ships from all sides and anchoring them in a double line, after which a mound of earth was heaped upon them and fashioned in the manner of the Appian Way. Over this bridge he rode back and forth for 2 successive days. The first day on the caparisoned horse, himself resplendent in a crown of oak leaves, a buckler, a sword, and a cloak of cloth of gold. So, fancy clothes. Fancy clothes. A gold cloak. Not to be confused with the gold cloaks of King's Landing. On the second, in the dress of a charioteer, in a car drawn by a pair of famous horses, carrying before him a boy named Darius, one of the hostages from Parthia. What? We don't negotiate with terrorists. So, a hostage. So, we see here, ancient Rome, they were fine with having hostages. And attended by the entire Praetorian Guard, and a company of his friends in Gallic chariots. So, it appears then, they did take some of the Gallic culture. They had the Caesar's Gallic Wars, and the fact that they were able to put some of their chariots in the Gallic fashion shows that they were fine with integrating new cultures. Interesting. I know that many have supposed that Gaius devised this kind of bridge in rivalry of Xerxes, who excited no little admiration. Xerxes, isn't that the guy with the 300 Spartans? Who excited no little admiration by bridging the much narrower Hellespont. Others, that it was to inspire fear in Germany and Britain, on which he had designs by the fame of some stupendous work. But when I was a boy, I used to hear my grandfather say that the reason for the work, as revealed by the emperor's confidential courtiers, was that Thrasyllus, the astrologer, had declared to Tiberius, when he was worried about his successor, and inclined towards his natural grandson, that Gaius had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding about over the Gulf of Baiae with horses. He also gave shows in foreign lands, Athenian games at Syracuse in Sicily. And Sicily, Syracuse, Athenian games. I wonder what would be the nuance of... I wonder if the Athenian games are more Olympic style stuff rather than gladiatorial games. I wonder if that's the difference. Or rather one of it. At the latter place, also a contest in Greek and Latin oratory, in which they say the losers gave prizes to the victors, and were forced to compose eulogies upon them, while those who were least successful were ordered to erase their writings with a sponge or with their tongue. Ew! Unless they elected... What? Rather to be beaten with rods or thrown into the neighboring river. What kind of Joffrey stuff is this? So, oratory contest. Oratory contest. So if you lose, you gotta... I think they might have been writing with chalk or something. He had to use a sponge. That's fine. Or your tongue, dry. And then you could be beaten with a rod. Thrown into the river. I think using a sponge and being tossed in the river is preferable. He completely... Talk about humiliation. An incentive to really make sure you do good. That's intense. He completed the public works which had been half finished under Tiberius, namely the temple of Augustus and the theatre of Pompey. He likewise began an aqueduct in the region near Tibur and an amphitheatre beside the Septa, the former finished by his successor Claudius, while the latter was abandoned. At Syracuse he repaired the city walls which had fallen into ruin through lapse of time, and the temples of the gods he had planned besides, to rebuild the palace of Polycrates at Samos, to finish the temple of Didymaean Apollo at Ephesus, to found a city high up in the Alps, but above all to dig a canal through the Isthmus in Greece. And he had already sent a chief centurion to survey the work. Chief centurion. So we see public works, infrastructure. The older I get, and the more I see how dilapidated America's railways are, the subways, you begin to realize the importance of infrastructure and public works. And with pollution on the rise, we have to also be mindful of the environment and how we can shape the infrastructure to be more green, I'd argue. So much for Caligula. As emperor, we must now tell of his career as a monster. After he had assumed various surnames, for he was called Pius, child of the camp, father of the armies, and the greatest and best of Caesars, chancing to overhear some kings who had come to Rome to pay their respects to him, disputing at dinner about the nobility of their descent, he cried, "Let there be one lord, one king." And he came near, assuming a crown at once, and changing the semblance of a principate into the form of a monarchy. But on being reminded that he had risen above the elevation both of princes and kings, he began from that time on to lay claim to divine majesty, So we've noticed the deification of rulers and of senators and people in general in ancient Roman culture. The thing that's great about Islam, in my opinion, is our focus on Tawheed, oneness of Allah, and that all Allah is the Most High. You can't rival the one true God. Here we kind of see the problem with polytheism and this sort of paganism, is that they really just start calling anyone and anything divine. For after giving orders that statues of the gods as were especially famous for their sanctity or their artistic merit, including that of Jupiter of Olympia, should be brought from Greece, in order to remove their heads and put his own in their place. Oh my goodness. Creepy. Megalomaniac. He built out a part of the palace as far as the forum, and making the temple of Castor and Pollux its vestibule, he often took his place between the divine brethren. So he went in the middle of Castor and Pollux. So he's positioning himself quite symbolically, and exhibited himself there to be, oh my goodness, what? To be worshipped by those who presented themselves. So, a little bit of Pharaoh complex. Pharaoh complex. Notice, there's a pattern in history where people... Now, we fear Allah. We know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the Most High. You can notice how we pray, we prostrate. So we also bend, put our hands on our knees, and we prostrate and we sit. We don't just stand and like wave our hands in the air. Someone on stage plays a guitar and does something strange with their silly songs. We have a very somber, stoic way of praying, and that, I think, in my personal opinion, makes sure to nip in the bud any type of arrogance, inshallah, that would try to sprout. The difference in culture we're noticing with the ancient Romans is they think they can rival Apollo, Zeus, Mars, and stuff like that. And since they have half-bloods, so, Zeus goes, pardon me, goes down, reproduces with earthly women, then you get people who are half and half demigods. This creates a strange pantheon and opens the door for people to say that, oh, Zeus god has children and we're one of them. So when we say in Islam that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has no children, I think that's very potent, because it wipes off this type of arrogance that comes from that door that has been opened. Caligula clearly here, he knows what he's doing. Putting himself between the idols, and then, Castor and Pollux, allowing himself to be worshipped. Insane in the membrane. And some hailed him as Jupiter Laetaris. Ridiculous. He also set up a special temple to his own godhead, with priests and with victims of the choicest kind. In this temple was a life-size statue of the emperor in gold. See that? The gold idols. Why is this so prevalent? Different cultures making golden idols. We see in the Bible and in Islam, the golden calf that the Ismailis put, and Moses goes to Mount Sinai? Forgot the name of the mountain. Where he goes to get supposedly the tablets, the 10 Commandments for the Christians and whatnot, and they come back, oh, they're all worshipping this golden calf. Quite strange. The Aztecs with their gold. Why? It is a pretty mineral, no doubt, but this emphasis on gold. You look at the Oscars? They have that little golden statue. Peculiar. Which was dressed each day in clothing such as he wore himself. What a psychopath. He dressed his... The richest citizens used all their influence to secure the priesthoods of his cult and bid high for the honor. So notice how then the wealthy class, they playing in to the madness. Sort of like what people do with Trump today. You gotta compliment him, stroke his ego, you get whatever you want. Be a sycophant, you'll get in. It's a strategy. So we sometimes think that when people get money, they'll just say whatever they want because they're no longer bound by the economic oppressionary chains. As in, once I get money, I'll be able to say and do what I want. When in reality, I think we're noticing when people get money, they want to say whatever is okay so they can keep having money. And, so they don't get their businesses boycott, so that they're able to have their banking privileges, all that. Here, the richest citizens, they're totally helping the psychosis of Caligula to grow. They're nourishing it. They're fostering it, an environment for it to bloom even worse. Quite peculiar. The victims were flamingos, peacocks, woodcock, guinea hens, and pheasants, offered day by day, each after its own kind. So animal sacrifice. Animal sacrifice. So, again, you'll see the white Christian supremacist, nationalist, those types. They'll say, like, Islam is evil because they have, during Hajj, right, you can sacrifice a goat. You know, the meat's given to the poor and all that. Camel, cow, chicken. And some places for a akika, when a child is born. You name it. Now, does that also mean that the ancient Romans were evil for having animal sacrifice? Now, they're pagan, so we don't approve of the pagan sacrifice. But animal sacrifice is inherently evil? Now, for us, from my understanding, you can only sacrifice in the name of Allah. You can't say in the name of Moses or Joseph, anything like that. You can't commit shirk. You can have an animal harvested to honor your guest. Like, hey, you're coming to visit me in town? I'm gonna harvest this big old cow that I've been Wagyu beef styling, growing it for you. And when the guy comes to process the animal, he says Bismillah and does the halal form of culling it. And so, not to confuse it with, like, you can't say someone else's name during the culling process, right? So you cull the animal in the name of Allah to honor your guest. You see what I'm saying? The nuance there? I hope I'm explaining that well. Because you want to avoid shirk. Here we see this type of shirk practice, where somebody is accepting that they would have something like that killed. Now notice, a flamingo, it's quite rare, quite a delicate bird. So I noticed colors here. Pheasants, peacocks, and flamingos, quite beautiful birds. The males of the peacock and pheasants are quite beautiful. So I do find that to be creepy, that he wants to sacrifice these critters. And guinea hens, no, you know, I think only really the peacock is one that has a good amount of meat on it. The other ones don't got too much meat, so I think it's just sacrificing beauty at that point, not necessarily having it for meat. At night he used constantly to invite the full and radiant moon into his embraces and his bed, while in the daytime he would talk confidently with Jupiter Capitolinus, now whispering and then in turn putting his ear to the mouth of the god, now in louder and even angrier language. For he was heard to make the threat, "Lift me up, or I'll lift thee." Ooh, the audacity. You see that? How they behave? The sort of weird, megalomaniac, mega-brained, mega-moron attitude going on. But finally won by entreaties, as he reported, and even invited to live with the god, he built a bridge over the temple of the deified Augustus, and thus joined his palace to the Capitol. Creepy. He built a bridge just for that. Presently, to be nearer yet, he laid the foundations of a new house in the court of the Capitol. So, how should we word this? Foundations, and so building a bridge. Bizarre. Designing his dwelling place to be able to be connected to these spiritual spots. Quite bizarre. He did not wish to be thought the grandson of Agrippa, or called so because of the latter's humble origin. So see, he has this sort of shame on where he came from. And he grew very angry if anyone in a speech or song included Agrippa among the ancestors of the Caesars. Now notice here in America, now it's kind of the opposite. Senators will be like, I came from a small town in Georgia, and it was very small. We had about 800 people. That's how you'll see today. And then you look it up and you actually fact check the senators or the politician in general, and you see that they were for somewhat of a quite privileged family. He even boasted that his own mother was born. Okay, so notice here, we're noticing a pattern of Caligula's behavior where he doesn't want any type of humble origin to be listed, and that he wanted to claim divine majesty. He, remember, placed himself between Castor and Pollux, and then set himself up as some sort of divine brethren to them. He allowed himself to be worshipped. He wanted people to hail him as Jupiter Litaris. Okay? Quite intense stuff going on. He even boasted that his own mother was born in incest, which Augustus had committed with his daughter Julia, and not content with this slur on the memory of Augustus, he forbade the celebration of his victories at Actium and off Sicily by annual festivals, on the ground that they were disastrous and ruinous to the Roman people. Wow. So, attacks the legacy of Augustus, and then he thinks it's a good thing to be born of such an atrocious action. Creepy. Obviously. So, what a deranged individual. He often called his great-grandmother Livia Augusta a Ulysses in petticoats, and he had the audacity to accuse her of low birth in a letter to the Senate, alleging that her maternal grandfather had been nothing but a decurion of Fundi, whereas it is proved by public records that Aufidius Lurco held high offices at Rome. When his grandmother, Antonia, asked for a private interview, he refused it, except in the presence of the prefect Macro, and by such indignities and annoyances he caused her death. Although some think that he also gave her poison. We're noticing as well lots of poisonings going on in this time period. Pretty crazy. His grandma. Wow. So people accuse him of poisoning his grandma. So let's write grandma over here. What a wicked grandson. After she was dead, he paid her no honor, but viewed her burning pyre from his dining room. He had his brother Tiberius put to death without warning. Oh my goodness. So, ordered the killing of his brother. Suddenly sending a tribune of the soldiers to do the deed. Besides driving his father-in-law Silanus to end his life, by, we'll say, the throat with a razor. Oh my goodness, subhanallah. So, clearly we've seen thus far the behavior of Caligula being exactly what we expected. You know, if this isn't my first section on reading about Caligula, each author will cover different things. This is from the perspective of Suetonius. Okay? So that's important. His charge against the latter was that Silanus had not followed him when he put to sea in stormy weather, but had remained behind in the hope of taking possession of the city in case he should be lost in the storm. Okay, so he felt like, you didn't follow me into the storm, you stayed behind for an opportune moment to snatch what is mine, hoping that I would perish at sea, and you yourself would be strategically positioned to take possession of the city. Tiberius, against Tiberius, that his breath smelled of an antidote, which he had taken to guard against being poisoned at his hand. Can you imagine how evil that'd be for your brother to be like, I smell in your breath an antidote to poison. Are you afraid I'm gonna poison you? And it's like, oh boy. Now, as a matter of fact, Silanus was subject to seasickness and wished to avoid the discomforts of the voyage, while Tiberius had taken medicine for a chronic cough, which was growing worse. As for his uncle Claudius, he spared him merely as a laughingstock. So, a lot of people have pointed out that Uncle Claudius was like the jester for Caligula. Intense madness. So it was quite innocent that Silanus and Tiberius' breath was different because they're trying to take some medicine for their ailments. He lived in habitual incest with all his sisters, and at large banquet he placed each of them in turn below him, while his wife reclined above. So, we obviously don't know if that's true. However, it's been attributed to him through sources, and a lot of people, we just saw how he claimed that Augustus did that with his daughter, quite evil, but clearly he doesn't look upon it as bad. But the good part is that in Islam, such behavior wouldn't be allowed. Of these, he believed to have violated Drusilla when he was still a minor, and even to have been caught lying with her by his grandmother Antonia, at whose house they were brought up in company. Afterwards, when she was the wife of Lucius Cassius Longinus, an ex-consul, he took her from him and openly treated her as the lawful wife. That's creepy. And when ill, he made her heir to his property on the throne. When she died, he appointed a season of public mourning, during which it was a capital offense to laugh, bathe, or dine in company with one's parents. What? So she dies, and it's a capital offense, so that means the death penalty. So, do you see the oppression coming in? If you laugh, if you just wash yourself, and if you have a meal with your family, you can be murdered by the state, wife or children. So you're not allowed to have a meal with your loved ones, to bathe, or have a laugh, because Caligula put in some stupid season of public mourning for his dumb sister. He was so beside himself with grief that suddenly fleeing the city by night and traversing Campania, he went to Syracuse and hurriedly returned from there without cutting his hair or shaving his beard, and he never afterwards took oath about matters of the highest moment, even before the assembly of the people or in the presence of the soldiers, except by the Godhead of Drusilla. Godhead of Drusilla, what the heck? So we're just seeing way too many people being deified. So Drusilla equals the sister rule, right? And it says multiple sisters here, but Drusilla is the one they're focusing on at the moment. The rest of his sisters he did not love with so great affection, nor honor so highly, but often prostituted them to his favorites, so that he was the readier at the trial of Aemilius Lepidus to condemn them as adulteresses and privy to the conspiracies against him. And he not only made public letters in the handwriting of all of them, procured by fraud and seduction, but also dedicated to Mars the Avenger, with explanatory inscription, 3 swords designed to take his life. So, not only did he corrupt his sisters, but he set them up to be slandered, to be mocked, to not really be respected anymore. That is absolutely dystopian. It is not easy to decide whether he acted more basely in contracting his marriages, in annulling them, or as husband at the marriage of Livia Orestilla to Gaius Piso. He attended the ceremony himself, gave orders that the bride be taken to his own house, and within a few days divorced her. 2 years later he banished her, because of suspicion that in the meantime she had gone back to her former husband. So, marriage perils. So to marry him is a huge risk. So, sure, he can provide, he's wealthy, but he's quite insane. So when some people glorify, oh, you have to always marry rich, careful, you might get a Caligula. Others write that being invited to the wedding banquet, he sent word to Piso, who reclined opposite to him, "Don't take liberties with my wife," and at once carried her off with him from the table, the next day issuing a proclamation that he had got himself a wife in the manner of Romulus and Augustus. When the statement was made that the grandmother of Lollia Paulina, who was married to Gaius Memmius, an ex-consul commanding armies, had once been a remarkably beautiful woman, he suddenly called Lollia from her province, separated her from her husband, and married her. Okay, so Lollia Paulina, married to Gaius Memmius, he was an ex-consul, he commanded armies, she's pretty, he calls her forth, makes her divorce her husband, and then marries her. Then, it says here, in a short time he put her away, with a command never to have intercourse with anyone. So, a lot of women are like, pick me, but clearly, you don't want that, you do not want that. Livia Orestilla, he had treated her terribly, and then, that's terrible. And then Lollia Paulina. Though Caesonia was neither beautiful nor young, and was already mother of 3 daughters by another, besides being a woman of reckless extravagance and wantonness, he loved her not only more passionately but more faithfully, often exhibiting her to the soldiers riding by his side, decked with cloak, helmet, and shield, and to his friends even in a state of nudity. What? What is going on? He did not honor her with the title of wife until she had borne him a child, announcing on the selfsame day that he had married her, and that he was the father of her babe, this babe whom he named Julia Drusilla. He carried to the temples of the goddesses, finally placing her in the lap of Minerva, and commending to her the child's nurture and training, and no evidence convinced him so positively that she was sprung from his own loins as her savage temper, which was even then so violent that she would try to scratch the faces and eyes of the little children who played with her. Oh my goodness. What the heck is going on? It would be trivial and pointless to add to this account of his treatment of his relatives and friends. But Ptolemy, son of King Juba, his cousin, for he was the grandson of Mark Antony by Antony's daughter Selene, and in particular Macro himself, and even Ennia, who helped him to the throne. All these were rewarded for their kinship and their faithful services by a bloody death. Whoa. He was no whit more respectful or mild towards the Senate, allowing some who held the highest offices to run in their togas for several miles before his chariot, and to wait on him at table, standing napkins in hand, either at the head of his couch or at his feet. So, he not respectful to the Centaurs. Just kidding. So notice that. I think that's kind of funny. So, to run in their togas for several miles besides his chariot. That's kind of... You gotta run, AOC. Get to work. Like all those senators. Or what's that guy's? Dan Crenshaw. He lost his election, but that would be kind of funny. Run, one-eyed pirate. Keep going. And to wait... Others he secretly put to death. Oh, that's gnarly. Yet continued to send for them as if they were alive after a few days, falsely asserting that they had committed or deleted themselves. When the consuls forgot to make proclamations of his birthday, he deposed them and left the state for 3 days without its highest magistrates. He flogged his quaestor, who was charged with conspiracy, stripping off the man's clothes and spreading them under the soldiers' feet to give them a firm footing as they beat him. So flogging. Fascinating. So, you hear a lot about ancient Rome, how the architecture, the values, but they never really say which emperor. You ever notice that? You'll see a lot of the white supremacist Christian nationalists of the right wing. They love the ancient Roman aura, architecture, mythos, personas, and that time period, but they don't always highlight which time period. We could see that when it got to Tiberius, things started going pretty crazy, but also Sulla, before Tiberius, before Gaius Julius Caesar, it gets a little bit spicy. And Rome has always had a chaotic past with bloodshed and bad leaders, so can you truly only like the good and not like the bad? Something to think about. He treated the other orders with like insolence and cruelty. So, insolence and cruelty being part of Caligula's overall conduct. Being disturbed by the noise made by those who came in the middle of the night to secure the free seats in the circus. He drove them all out with cudgels. In the confusion, more than 20 Roman knights were crushed to death, with as many matrons and countless number of others. At the plays in the theater, sowing discord between the commons and the knights, he scattered the gift tickets ahead of time to induce the rabble to take the seats reserved for the equestrian order. At a gladiatorial show, he would sometimes draw back the awnings when the sun was hottest and give orders that no one be allowed to leave. Then, removing the usual equipment, he would match worthless and decrepit gladiators against mangy wild beasts and have sham fights between householders who were of good repute, but conspicuous for some bodily infirmity. Sometimes, too, he would shut up the granaries and condemn the people to hunger. So the granaries is where your food storages are. Obviously flour, using grain, grinding it into flour to make bread. Literally bread in circuses being staples of the Roman culture. To deny people their flour to make their bread, the grain they grind, that's pretty deadly, No refrigeration at this time. Not good. The following are special instances of his innate brutality. So, one second here. You see how when Trump was holding back the food stamp snappy BT, he had money for his ballroom. He didn't set up, okay, I'm going to use my own personal money, fund food banks, let's get the people fed. Nope, you saw MAGA do the opposite, and I showed you that. And I thought that was a very important, longest shutdown in United States history under Orange Man. And MAGA, the top influencers, accepted money, aka bribes, to push on social media that instead of getting mad at Trump for denying the people food, instead turn and say, if you can't feed them, don't breed them. So what does that mean? If you're poor and you can't feed your kids, you shouldn't have had kids. Same people say they're pro-life. Same people will then LARP and say, we're trad, have 10 kids. Women shouldn't vote. Don't go to college. And then when that woman is totally dependent upon the state in times of poverty, they ridicule, mock, degrade them and say, oh, how dare you be able to get a nice mustard or a box of cookies for your kids. So Jeremy from the Quartering, an obese, porn addict Christian, he's part of the MAGA cult, and he was mad that you could get Grey Poupon mustard. So nitpicking, bullying, tons of people lamented the ability of poor people to get some things on Amazon and being able to go to McDonald's. You shouldn't eat McDonald's, I'd argue, but still, they would handpick them. And a lot of the white supremacist Christian nationalist accounts would repost some black women showing what they would get, their haul, and they would say, oh, this is why we have to gut the program, look how much they're eating, and da-da-da-da-da. They barely have anything, and a lot of it's processed foods. But MAGA wanted to make it to where the people wouldn't have the funds ready for the SNAP and EBT program. So when you notice how Caligula here claims Suetonius that he shut up the granaries and people became more hungry, you can see some examples of tyranny and oppression. So oppression in this time, cutting off necessary staples of food, okay? And one could also argue that oppressive tariffs, inflation, and things of that nature cause people to spend more with their food expenses. So he was tough on China. We get a lot of cheap Chinese products, cheap Chinese food that's affordable for the average person. The American dream, I said many times, is propped up by Chinese goods. People don't want to admit that, but it's just a fact. If you look on the bottom of everything, it says made in China. Most all this stuff. Americans don't really manufacture much anymore. And so Trump has caused more people to go hungry, and now with his war with Iran, he has caused people in Bangladesh and other places to ration petrol, gas, stuff like that. And if something isn't done, because Iran, to protect themselves, they shut the Strait of Hormuz, and they're letting China pass through and other people, but not America, and is not real because of the aggression. And this, because Trump started this for Netanyahu, is going to cause more people to go hungry. So Caligula intentionally cuts off the food from the people, the granaries, right? But we have to understand that Trump as well, if you look, he's caused plenty of people to go hungry, as he has these lavish parties in Mar-a-Lago, okay? As he builds a ballroom for the rich to party in, to drink, snort coke, and get escorts. And you may be thinking, no, Trump's a Christian. He hung out with Jeffrey Epps all the time, okay? Melania wasn't some trad lady, okay? She did nude photography. She was a supermodel. She went on the Lolita Express. She's not some beacon. She is beautiful and has this kind of... She has a very classy aura. Classy as in stylish, I mean. Not as a beacon of like warmth, motherly energy, but as very vogue. She doesn't really match with Trump, I'd argue. But she has that energy to her. So he doesn't really have a trad wife. So you look at him, just Trump as a human being, he's not some benevolent person, in my opinion. When you see how much disturbances he's caused to the needy who are so hungry, he's made food more scarce. So look at how Caligula's behaved. You can look at Trump's behavior. Trump right now is starving Cuba. He's got a lot of punishments upon Cuba to try to bend them. And he said in an interview, I can take Cuba, I can do whatever I want with it. With a sovereign country, with those people's lives. Electricity is not working very well. They're suffering quite a lot, the Cubans. And Trump wants to build a casino upon the graveyard that is Palestine. So, and he shared that AI video, I covered it. Oh, so, man, he's a terrible person. Terrible, terrible person. So when I'm reading stuff like this, I keep thinking of Trump. He is quite cruel. The following are special instances of his innate brutality. When cattle to feed the wild beasts which he had provided for a gladiatorial show were rather costly, he selected criminals to be devoured. I don't see nothing wrong with that. Depends on the crime they committed, right? But, I mean, do you want to have like America where you have some of the most wicked individuals just sitting there, absorbing food and water and resources, not doing any work? The line of prisoners without examining the charges. Okay, see, so he didn't examine what they were in for. But, merely taking his place in the middle of a colonnade, he bade them to be led away from the bald head to bald head. What? A man who made a vow to fight in the arena, if the emperor recovered, he compelled to keep his word, watched him as he fought sword in hand, and would not let him go until he was victorious. And then only after many entreaties, another who had offered his life in the same reason, but delayed to kill him his own self, he turned over to his slaves, with orders to drive them through the streets, decked with sacred bows and fillets, calling for the fulfillment of his vow, and finally hurled him from the embankment. Many men of honorable rank were first disfigured with the marks of branding irons. When he mentioned that many men of honor, he allowed them to be disfigured with branding irons. That is really dark. So branding irons. So we're noticing his cruelty becoming more apparent. It is funny for him to kind of be rude to the senators, you know. But when it comes to regular people, that's when you're like, oh, that's not good. And then condemned to the mines, to work at building roads, or to be thrown to the wild beasts. So thrown to the wild beasts. Or else he shut them up in cages on all fours. So very strange. Like animals, or had them sawn under. Not all these punishments were for serious offenses, but merely for criticizing one of his shows, so not very serious offenses, or for never having sworn by his genius. He forced parents to attend the executions of their sons, sending a litter for one man who pleaded ill health, and inviting another to dinner immediately after witnessing death, and trying to rouse him to gaiety and jesting by a great show of affability. So gaiety as in like happiness, joyfulness, playfulness. He had the manager of his gladiatorial shows and beast baitings beaten with change in his presence for several successive days. So the manager of his gladiatorial shows and beast baiting games, so the manager of the games, he allowed to be beaten, and would not kill him until he was disgusted at the stench of his putrefied brain. Okay, so we see a little bit of our... I wonder if the character Ramsay Bolton, if George R. R. Martin studied a little bit of Caligula for that. Because the whole concept of reek what he did to Theon Greyjoy. You can notice a little bit of the stench aspect coming in. He burned a writer of Attilan farces alive in the middle of the arena of the amphitheater because of a humorous line of double meaning when a Roman knight, on being thrown to the wild beast, loudly protested his innocence. He took him out and cut off his tongue and put him back again. So what are we noticing here? We're noticing that Caligula seems to truly have this ability to willy-nilly condemn people to tormentous actions. He likes to torment people. So, for us as believers, as Muslims, we have to understand the difference between strength and cruelty, the mode of discipline versus transgression, the mode of carrying out righteous consequences, and being weary of oppression and tyranny. Because you can get obsessed with that over time. You can become mixed if you don't have a straight moral compass. Because if you also notice something, it doesn't appear thus far in our reading that Caligula allowed people to correct him. In fact, if you did, he may drive you to delete yourself. He may have you flogged until oblivion. Remember, he allowed some people to be devoured by wild animals. He caged people, made them be on all fours, as if they were animals. And he did all these terrible things to people who hadn't even committed serious offenses. Okay? And he made parents watch their children's execution. So, dangerous. So, I wonder if you are not able to handle criticism, constructive or otherwise, if you become a sort of Caligula tyrant. What's fascinating further is Elijah Schaffer, when he got caught cheating on his wife and then cheating with a married woman, Sarah Stock, a right-wing e-grifter, trad LARPing woman who had her wedding blessed by the Pope. He called himself for a while Caligula after that. He changed his username. Now it just says E. But before he changed it to Caligula. And some people might not really get that. But it's creepy that Elijah Schaffer would call himself Caligula when you see what Caligula did. And then that when Milo leaked the audio of how Elijah talks to his wife when she has the small baby, you begin to notice like that's some cruelty going on there, you know. He had a wife who would stay home and take care of the children, and he oppressed her with strange intimacy demands and things like that. And some contend that he cheated on her with men as well, which Caligula was into that too, you know, and he oppressed her. And then the Groypers, Nick Fuentes' fans, defended Elijah Schaffer's audacious boasting and bragging of adultery. And so Caligula brags about his insolence and cruelty and fornication and lewd acts, and then you have Elijah Schaffer doing that. And then he'll sit there and say, you know, Christ is king, and now he's trying to be an Orthodox Christian after he called himself Caligula. So it's fascinating. That's why when you look at the white supremacist Christian nationalists, when they use Roman iconography, you always have to wonder, what aspect of it are you hinting at? You must be careful, truly. He burned a writer of Italian farces alive in the middle of the arena. Intense. Having asked a man who had been recalled from an exile of long standing how in the world he spent his time there, The man replied by way of flattery, I constantly pray to the gods for what has come to pass, that Tiberius might die and you become emperor. Thereupon Caligula, thinking that his exiles were likewise praying for his death, sent emissaries from island to island to butcher them all. Wishing to have one of the senators torn to pieces, he induced some of the members to assail him suddenly on his entrance into the house, with charge of being a public enemy, to stab him with their styles and turn him over to the rest to be mangled. And his cruelty was not stated until he saw the man's limbs, members, and bowels dragged through the streets and heaped up before him. So this sounds a lot like what Sulla put a bounty on senators he didn't like either. So let's write over here, bounty upon senators. Now, could this be a little bit of an inflation? Yes, no, maybe so. But remember, we're dealing with a civilization of a long time ago. And surely today, the elites, they do shady things. There's a meme called the Clinton body count. You get in the way of Hillary Clinton, you disappear. So I'd argue that the elites still do these terrible things, but they do it more covertly. It's not so open. So maybe in this time period, this type of flex of raw power was able to be done because it was a different decorum back then, different style. Today you have different laws, different customs. I think of the series called Gangs of London. I think it was called. It was a decent series. There were some lewd scenes that could have been cut out that didn't really matter to the plot. But the way in which the rich would send assassin teams to take out people they didn't like and approve of anymore, I think that's kind of what happens today. Past, they conduct their assassinations more openly. Today, it's more covertly so they can cover their reputation so they can keep conducting business as usual. So, when we see the parts of the victims being heaped in front of Caligula, that sounds very cavemanish, very primal. Could that have been done? Maybe. But him ordering people to be shanked publicly and sinners to participate in this, I don't know about that. Because I wonder how chaotic could it get before people would take out Caligula in this way. And the exiles, he thought, were praying for his death, and then he sends emissaries to go to each island and butcher them all. That's pretty intense. He didn't have any evidence. So you can see when the founding fathers talked about the right to a trial and to have a jury of your peers, that's very notable. He added to the enormity of his crimes by the brutality of his language. He used to say that there was nothing in his own character which he admired and approved more highly than what he called his something in Greek, that is to say, his shameless impudence. So, impudence. So, notice here, we got words to describe Caligula: impudence, insolence, cruelty, and also barbarity, and lewdness. When his grandmother Antonia gave him some advice, he was not satisfied merely not to listen, but replied, "Remember that I have the right to do anything to anybody." So, you know how Trump, that's fascinating, we just thought about that. He says he can do whatever he wants with Cuba. That tyrannical mindset, where you think you're above. This is why we fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Allah is the Most High. You cannot escape the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, He's the mighty and sublime, swift in accounting, all-knowing, all-seeing. He knows what's in the chest. We can see our place. But when the Christians call Jesus God, and then Jesus was nailed to a cross, he's bloody, and he looks, when the Roman Catholics have the crucifix and there's that weak depiction of Jesus, just broken. They also call that God, so you're putting God in the image of a broken person, and then you say it's the Son of God, and it's all very quite strange. But when they depict God as weak, you see people don't really want to follow that as much. Weak, meek, and submissive. It's an impassive. It's a different type of energy. But so you can't fear God who looks so mangled upon the cross. How can a God be nailed to wood? How can nails hold a God? How can a God bleed? How can a God cry? That doesn't make sense to me. But when we look at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the wrath of Allah is something to be feared. So we must check ourselves before we wreck ourselves. If you don't, I think you get the Caligula mindset, where it's, oh, I have the right to do anything to anybody. We as Muslims can't say that. Allah has rights upon us. We have rights to our fellow believers. We have to maintain the Quran and Sunnah. We have modes of adab, modes of manners that we are to live up to. Okay? We have to be mindful of Judgment Day, because we don't want to have our record handed to us in our left hand. We don't want to be condemned to the flames. Therefore, we have to maintain our love for Allah, but the fear of Allah. See, some people say, God is love, we're His children. And when you make God, like when you no longer fear God and it's all about love and vibes, you're able to transgress more. Because fear is a very potent way of regulating behavior, far more than love. Which is why I think Niccolo Machiavelli said that it's better to be feared than loved, but not to be hated and feared. Because if you're a ruler and the people fear you but respect you, they'll obey you more than if they just love you. Because you can love someone and disrespect them all the time. I mean, look how many people cheat on the person. I love her, she takes care of my kids, but they go and they cheat. Oh, I love him, he's such a good dad, and they go and cheat, you see? It's easier to misuse and mistreat someone whom you love than someone whom you fear. You know, although when you do fear someone, you become more, you look for loopholes, you look at strategies to get away from the punishment. So a sort of deviant cleverness arouses. And yes, sometimes if you love someone, it stops you from going beyond a certain threshold. But again, fear is more potent. If you don't have fear, I think you get the Caligula mindset, where Caligula, as we have seen, pictures himself as a sort of demigod. And the pagan Romans, they deify humans. Okay? So you're seeing a constant one-up of their past ancestors, and he wants to be a sort of demigod. And once someone sees themselves, like with that Fir'aun, with that Pharaoh mindset and mode of conduct, they get such an inflated ego that they become tyrants and oppressors in the land. And then they start thinking they don't have to answer to nobody. It's strange. That's why we have to always be careful and be able to do deep introspection so that we don't get a Caligula mindset. When he was on the point of killing his brother and suspected that he had taken drugs as a precaution against poison, he cried, "What an antidote against Caesar! After banishing his sisters, he made the threat that he not only had islands, but swords as well." An ex-praetor who had retired to Antiquera for his health sent frequent requests for an extension of his leave, but Caligula had him put to death, adding that a man who had not been helped by so long a course of hellebore need to be bled. On signing the list of prisoners who were to be put to death every 10 days, he said that he was clearing his accounts. Having condemned several Gauls and Greeks to death in a body, he boasted that he had subdued Gallogracia. Wow, so Gauls, Greeks, I see two words here. Gallo-Gracia sounds like the Gallic Greeks, because Gracia sounds like Greeks and Gallo sounds like Gauls. So notice the willy-nilly nature of him condemning people to death. No reverence for life, really. And I think when you examine how Trump said, yeah, that's what happens in war, like people die, like the way, I'm butchering it, but there was a quote recently about the Iran war where people were comparing him to Lord Farquaad of Shrek, where some of you may die, but that's a risk I'm willing to take. And people started memeing Trump that he's utterly so callous with the lives of the soldiers, even though he's a draft dodger, bone spurs, and he made all these excuses so that he didn't have to be drafted. And then people say that Barron Trump should be drafted. I did a video on that as well. So his callousness for the soldiers, and then they warmonger and enlist your children. They didn't go in the war, and so they become sort of immune to feeling the loss that truly comes from war. Caligula clearly has lost that sort of respect for life and frequently likes to condemn people to the death penalty. Trump, fine with allowing the death, even though he's like, oh, I'll end the Ukraine-Russia war because there's too many people who have died. And then meanwhile, he's like, yeah, let's just go ahead and start some problems with Iran. Terrible. And then lied about the attack on the girls' school in Iran. Then we find out, yes, it was, unfortunately, America who did it, and doesn't even have a soft heart for the little children. So, quite a monster. Quite a monster. So, I think when we look at Caligula here, we can see warning signs. We can also note why his name is infamous with cruelty. And I think truly that writers have made Joffrey Lannister and the Mad King and Ramsay Bolton based off of characters like Caligula, figures as Caligula rather. So there's a reason, I think, why in our consciousness as human beings, such stories of meanness, cruelty, depravity of the leaders, by the leaders, for the leaders, exists, because before the printing press was invented, you had the oral tradition, and clearly something must have happened in multiple civilizations consistently, this pattern of bad rulers and their appetite for malice. So you had to be careful. People have to regulate their leaders, otherwise they get a Caligula. I think this also speaks to what wealth does to someone's mind if they're not careful. It's very fascinating how you see rich people's kids, they get into some really strange stuff. The evil sorority chick, the degenerate rich guy, like in HBO's Succession. They have money, they have a disregard for the common person, they live in a totally different reality, they indulge in sin and debauchery, they don't use their wealth and status to do good in the world, but rather to indulge their debased passions and to corrupt themselves and society as a whole. And then their children become these wicked little beings that plague masses. So a bad leader affects the whole of the nation, and it's just so apparent that this pattern has happened throughout time, and Caligula is a prime example of that. We'll pause here. I hope you enjoyed. Highly educational section, and Caligula is a dark figure. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect the believers, guide the believers, give us righteous leaders in the community and leaders of nations. And may we all do deep introspection and work on our habits and repent for our sins and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide us to His straight path. Take care.